The sun hung low over the basin like a hammered coin, its molten light spilling across the hard pan and throwing long blue shadows from the cottonwoods. Heat shimmered above the baked earth, carrying the smell of dust and dry sage into every porch and alley of Ash Hollow. The town sat quiet, holding its breath as if the day itself were a question waiting to be answered. A stray dog slunk from shadow to shadow, ribs sharp against its hide, and the creak of a sign over the livery was the only sound that dared the silence. For weeks the name Colt Maddox had been spoken in whispers here, as if saying it too loud might draw the men himself out of the hills. He and his riders had stripped the ranches east of town, leaving only smoking beams and the bitter tang of gunpowder behind. Cattle disappeared in the night. A foreman was found hanging from a cottonwood at dawn, boots barely brushing the dust. Folks had stopped gathering on the boardwalks after dark, and even the gamblers in the saloon kept their laughter low, wary of echoes that might carry too far. That afternoon a shape emerged on the western trail, wavering through the haze like a ghost rising from the plain. Horse first, a rangy bay with a weary gait, then the rider, lean and tall under a battered hat. He moved at an unhurried walk, as though the miles behind him were merely another chore to be seen through. By the time he reached the first hitching post the sun had dipped enough to gild his shoulders in copper light, showing the gray that threaded his dark hair and the deep lines carved by wind and distance. He swung down with a fluid ease that belied the long ride, dust rising in a small halo around his boots. He gave his name as Jonas Hale when the stable boy approached, voice low but carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being heard. There was no smile in it, only a calm courtesy. He paid for the horse's keep with a silver coin that flashed once before it vanished back into the boy's pocket. Jonas's eyes, pale and sharp as flint, swept the street as he handed over the reins. It wasn't a glance for landmarks or simple curiosity. He measured doorways, alley mouths, the angle of rooftops. He noted which windows stood open and which shutters were drawn tight. The boy felt the man's attention like a draft on the back of his neck, and stepped aside without being told. Inside the saloon, the air was cooler but smelled of old whiskey and sweat. Conversations faltered as Jonas crossed the room, his boots whispering over warped boards. A card game paused mid-deal. A piano player let the last note fade into the thick silence. Jonas ordered coffee, not whiskey, and set a few coins on the bar. His duster shifted with emotion, revealing the well-worn grip of a Colt at his hip, the leather darkened by years of use. The barkeep poured quickly, eyes flicking to the gun, and slid the cup forward without a word. Jonas sipped, gazed distant, as if he were listening to something far off, perhaps the steady tick of time itself. Behind him, murmurs resumed in careful tones. He caught fragments, Maddox, burned barns, missing herds. The fear in those voices was a living thing, coiled and restless. He set his cup down and let his hand rest lightly on the bar, not in threat, but in patience. A door banged open, and the sheriff entered with the sun at his back. Sheriff Deke Rollins was broad and weathered, a man who had seen more than his share of trouble but still carried a streak of stubborn hope. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the stranger. "Don't get many travelers these days," he said, approaching with measured steps. "Trail's still open," Jonas replied, his tone as dry as the land outside. Rollins studied him for a beat longer, sensing the weight behind the words. "Name's Deke. You passing through or looking to settle?" "Just a place to rest the night." The sheriff gave a slow nod, though his gaze lingered on the gun at Jonas's side. "Fair enough. But keep your ears sharp. Maddox and his boys been prowling close. Folks are skittish." Jonas inclined his head, as though the name were a passing breeze. Yet his eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, a spark behind stone. Rollins noticed and filed it away. As dusk gathered, Jonas walked the main street, the fading light painting the clapboard buildings in bruised purples and gold. He paused outside the general store, where a young mother swept the step with quick, anxious motions. A small girl peeked from behind her skirts, clutching a rag doll. Jonas offered a gentle nod, and the child blinked at him with wide, solemn eyes before retreating into the folds of her mother's dress. He continued on, each step deliberate, as if his boots knew the rhythm of this place before he did. Night brought a restless wind that carried the scent of smoke from distant campfires. From the ridge beyond town came a faint echo, laughter, rough and reckless. A ranch hand on the porch of the boarding house stiffened and spat into the dust. "Maddox," he muttered, voice tight. Jonas paused, head tilted slightly, the sound threading into him like a memory. He stood there a long while, watching the dark hills where the stars were just beginning to prick through the indigo sky. Later, in his small rented room, he laid his hat on the chair and removed the duster. Underneath, his shirt bore the faded creases of many trails, but the revolver he unbuckled and set on the nightstand gleamed with meticulous care. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened, the creak of timber, the hush of the wind, the faint scuff of boots 2 doors down. Every noise mapped itself in his mind, each one a signal in a language few still understood. His hand brushed the scar along his jaw, an old white line that caught the moonlight. For a moment he closed his eyes, and the ghosts of other towns flickered behind his lids, faces and gun smoke, the weight of choices made long ago. Somewhere in the street a window slammed against its frame, startling a horse into a nervous whinny. Jonas rose and looked out. The town lay under a spill of moonlight, quiet except for the restless whisper of leaves. But beyond the black line of the ridge of fire glowed faintly, orange and mean. He watched it without expression, though his fingers drummed once on the sill, a slow, steady cadence. When dawn bled pale across the desert, Jonas was already awake, coat drawn tight against the chill. He walked the empty boardwalk as merchants stirred inside their shops, lamps winking to life. The town greeted him with wary eyes from behind curtains and half-open doors. They sensed something in him, an echo of danger, perhaps, or a promise of protection. It was hard to tell the difference in a land where both could wear the same face. At the far end of the street the sheriff waited, hat in hand, the weight of the coming day heavy in his stance. He looked up as Jonas approached, reading something unspoken in the set of the man's shoulders. "You planning to ride on?" Rollins asked. Jonas met his gaze, the first rays of sunlight sparking in his pale eyes. "Not yet," he said, voice quiet but final. "Not until it's done." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He didn't ask what it was. Some men carried their answers like loaded guns, and he knew enough not to touch either. He simply nodded and turned to watch the horizon, where the trail from the hills lay dark against the rising light, and where the distant fire of cold Maddox and his riders smoldered like the breath of an approaching storm. The evening sky bled red as the sun sagged behind the jagged ridgeline, a copper wash spreading over Ash Hollow until the town looked forged from molten iron. Heat from the day clung to the dirt street, mixing with the first chill of night, and every sound carried sharper in the thinning air. The creak of a porch step, the nervous whicker of a horse, the faint clatter of poker chips inside the saloon. People had learned to read the sky the way they read hoofbeats. Red dust meant change. Tonight it meant danger. A distant thunder of hooves began as a murmur and swelled to a drumbeat that rattled windows and hearts. From the darkening trail came the Maddox gang, 6 silhouettes against the ember horizon. Dust curled behind them like smoke from a brush fire. They rode 2 abreast, rifles slung careless across their backs, eyes glinting like stray sparks. Colt Maddox led the charge, his black hat low over a grin that had never known mercy. The gang rolled into town as if they owned the earth, the sound of their horses a single living roar. Doors slammed. Curtains fluttered shut. A barkeep's lantern was snuffed with a hurried breath. The street emptied in a heartbeat, leaving only the echo of hooves and the acrid smell of dust. Jonas Hale stood in the deep shadow of the saloon's porch, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes, his shoulders loose as though this arrival were merely a summer storm to be endured. He watched the gang fan out, their laughter rough as gravel. The leader reined up in the center of the street, a scar of moonlight cutting across his jaw. "Maddox." Sheriff Rollins's voice rang from somewhere near the jailhouse, hard but not steady. "This town's had enough of your business." The outlaw chuckled, a low sound that carried farther than a shout. "Sheriff, we ain't here for trouble. We're here for tribute." He swept an arm toward the saloon and the general store across the street. "Whiskey and cash. The cost of staying peaceful." 2 of his riders spurred forward, pounding up the saloon steps. Boards groaned under their boots as they shouldered through the swinging doors. Glass shattered inside, followed by the panicked cry of a waitress. Maddox tipped his hat toward the sheriff with mock courtesy. "Easy coin, friend. No reason for blood." Jonas did not move. He leaned against the porch post as the door burst open, and one of the riders tossed a bulging cash bag into Maddox's waiting hand. The other outlaw carried a bottle already uncorked, spilling amber drops onto the dusty boards. Behind Jonas, a tremor passed through the air like the shiver before lightning. He let it settle. Across the street, a woman clutched the frame of the general store doorway, eyes wide with terror. Clara Finch, he remembered, the young widow who'd swept her porch with nervous energy that morning. Beside her, a small boy whimpered, pressing his face into her skirts. A rider swung down from his horse and swaggered toward them, rifle glinting in the failing light. Jonas's gaze narrowed. He stepped from the shadow, boots silent on the porch, and crossed the street with an unhurried stride. Clara's eyes met his, a plea hidden in their sheen. Without a word he touched her elbow, steady and firm, guiding her back inside the store. The boy clung to her like a frightened bird. Jonas crouched to the child's level and whispered something low and even, a sound meant only for the small ears that needed carriage. Then he eased the door shut and turned to face the street. The rider approaching them had stopped, a smirk playing on his lips at the stranger's interference. He was broad-shouldered, his beard a tangle of dust and sweat. "You looking to play hero, old man?" he drawled, swinging his rifle lazily to one hand. Jonas's voice was calm as riverstone. "Best you keep riding." Laughter rippled from the others. The outlaw stepped closer, the scent of cheap whiskey wafting with the warm wind. "Maybe I like standing right here." Jonas tilted his head, eyes half-lidded, hand resting loose at his side. The outlaw's grin widened. He jerked a rifle barrel toward Jonas's chest, a drunken show of power. Before the gang's laughter could swell again, Jonas moved. It happened so fast the air seemed to fold in on itself. One heartbeat the outlaw stood gloating, the next his rifle spun from his grasp, clattering against the boards. Jonas's arm blurred, a flick of muscle and precision, and the man found himself staring down the barrel of his own weapon held expertly in another's hands. Silence crashed over the street like a breaking wave. The outlaw froze, breathing hard, confusion dawning behind his bloodshot eyes. Jonas did not speak. He simply stepped back and lowered the rifle to the ground, his movements measured, deliberate. The message was clear. This could have ended differently. From the center of the street cold Maddox leaned forward at his saddle, eyes narrowing to slits. He studied Jonas with a predator's curiosity. "Well now," he said softly, the words carrying in the hush. "Ain't you a quick one?" No one dared to move. The sheriff's hand hovered near his own gun, but he knew the draw would be futile. Maddox's men shifted in their saddles, uncertain. Jonas kept his gaze fixed on the leader, his face an unreadable mask carved by years of wind and hard decisions. Finally Maddox laughed, a sound sharp as a crow's call. "We'll remember you, stranger." He jerked his chin toward his men. "Mount up. We got what we came for." The gang hesitated, then obeyed. Horses snorted and stamped as they wheeled toward the dark hills, dust rising behind them in a ghostly plume. Maddox lingered a heartbeat longer, eyes locked on Jonas, something like recognition flickering there, an itch of memory he could not scratch. Then he yanked his reins and rode after the others, his laughter trailing like smoke. The town exhaled as if a cord had been cut. Doors opened a cautious inch. The piano inside the saloon struck a tentative note, and then fell silent again. Sheriff Rollins stepped into the street, his boots stirring little clouds of dust. "That was some trick," he said, voice low. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" Jonas offered nothing, only the faintest shrug. He set the rifle upright against the store wall, then tipped his hat to Clara as she emerged with her son, relief and lingering fear etched across her face. "You and the boy all right?" he asked. Her voice trembled but held steady. "Thanks to you." Jonas gave a small nod, as if the matter were no more than helping a neighbor carry a sack of grain. He turned to leave, but the boy reached out and caught his sleeve, eyes round with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Jonas crouched, met the child's gaze, and gave a ghost of a smile, an expression that warmed his weathered features for the briefest moment. The boy's grip loosened, comforted without a word. Night settled over Ash Hollow in earnest, stars prickling through a sky gone velvet black. The smell of dust and gun oil lingered like a memory that refused to fade. Jonas walked back toward the boarding house, each step unhurried, the town's murmured gratitude following in his wake. Behind him the blood-red glow of the earlier sky had deepened to darkness, but the echo of hooves on hardpan still haunted the edge of hearing, a promise that the night's reprieve was only a pause before the storm. Moonlight spread across the basin like a sheet of polished steel, cold and unbroken. In the hush of midnight the town of Ash Hollow lay tense and wakeful, lanterns dim behind shuttered windows. Far off, coyotes keened, their cries rising and falling like warnings no one wanted to name aloud. Word had come from a ranch hand who'd trailed the Maddox gang. Before dawn they meant to ride back and set the town alight, ablaze to remind every settlement from here to the Rio Grande that Colt Maddox ruled the night. Sheriff Rollins paced the length of the boardwalk, each step a struggle against helplessness. He'd fought bushwhackers and raiders, But this was different. Too many innocents. Too little time. Jonas Hale watched from the shadow of the livery, head brim low, coat collar turned against the restless wind. He said nothing until the sheriff stopped and looked his way, a plea hidden in the set of his shoulders. "They'll come," Rollins said, voice rasped dry. "I've maybe 6 men willing to stand." Jonas stepped forward, boots whispering over the dust. 6 can hold if they know how," he said, quiet but certain. "Gather whoever you trust. Meet at the church." The sheriff hesitated only a breath before nodding. Soon a handful of townsfolk crept into the pulpit interior of the small clapboard church, the blacksmith with soot still in his hair, the saloon keeper gripping a shotgun older than himself, 2 ranchers, a freckled boy barely old enough to shave, and Clara Finch with her child asleep against her shoulder. Fear clung to them like smoke. Jonas entered last and closed the door behind him, the click echoing like a gunshot. He moved to the front without ceremony. "You know what's coming," he said. "Maddox means to burn your homes and leave nothing but cinders. But a fire needs time to catch. Deny him that, and you keep this town." The blacksmith's jaw tightened. "We ain't soldiers." "You don't need to be." Jonas's gaze traveled over each face, steady and unyielding. "You need to be calm. You need to listen." They listened. He showed them how to stagger lanterns so moonlight wouldn't betray movement, how to station lookouts along the dry creek bed, how to use the narrow canyon just beyond the ridge as a choke point. His instructions were spare, precise, spoken in the even cadence of a man who had walked into danger so often it had become a second language. He never raised his voice, never let a flicker of doubt show. Clara stood apart, rocking her sleeping boy. Her hands trembled despite herself. Jonas approached, his presence a quiet anchor. "There's a root cellar beneath the parsonage," he told her. "Safe enough if the shooting starts." She lifted her chin, eyes shining with fear and something harder beneath. "I'll not hide while others fight for my home." For a moment he studied her, the moonlight through the stained glass catching the resolve in her face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then stay low. Keep your son behind the altar rail." Outside, clouds scudded across the moon, throwing the desert into pools of shadow and sudden silver. When the time came, they moved like ghosts to the canyon, hearts drumming with the knowledge that dawn was still hours away. The narrow pass curved between sheer walls of sandstone, the perfect funnel for a charging gang. Jonas placed the blacksmith and the ranchers behind boulders, set the boy with the saloon keeper near a ridge where echoes would mask their numbers. He carried no lantern, only the revolver at his hip and another thought hidden behind his eyes. They waited. The night stretched thin, every sound amplified, the tick of cooling rocks, the soft sigh of Clara's breath as she crouched near the altar rail back in town, the occasional snort of a restless horse. Jonas knelt at the canyon mouth, senses tuned to a distant rhythm only he seemed to hear. At last it came, the low thunder of hooves, the ragged laughter of men drunk on cruelty. The Maddox gang rode hard, their torches blazing, sparks scattering into the star-pierced dark. They charged into the canyon without caution, certain of easy prey. Jonas raised a hand, a silent signal. Rifles cracked like breaking branches. Flame-lit riders shouted in confusion as bullets whined off stone. Horses screamed, rearing against the sudden onslaught. The narrow walls turned every shot into a roar, magnifying the defense to sound like a company of soldiers. Maddox cursed and wheeled his mount, bellowing orders, but the canyon betrayed him. His men had no room to spread, no shadows deep enough to hide. Another volley rang out. A torch tumbled, snuffing in the dust. Panic rippled through the gang like fire through dry grass. Jonas moved among the defenders with uncanny precision, never frantic, always a step ahead. He guided the boy's trembling aim with a steady hand, shifted the blacksmith to cover a blind corner, slid across the rocks like a shadow cut from the night. When an outlaw broke through the first volley, Jonas drew and fired in a single motion so fluid it seemed part of the wind. The man toppled without a cry, his gun still unfired. Yet even in the chaos Jonas kept his skill veiled. He fired only when needed, his speed a whisper of the legend it once was. To the townsfolk he appeared simply unshakable, a man whose calm steadied their own. But Maddox, ducking behind his plunging horse, caught glimpses of something more, the impossible timing, the unerring accuracy, and unease flickered behind his wild eyes. The battle stretched into a fevered blur. Smoke thickened, mixing with a metallic tang of blood. An outlaw's torch struck the canyon wall and shattered, flames licking upward before dying in the thin air. Jonas pressed forward, forcing the gang back with calculated bursts of fire. Each move was deliberate, a chess master guiding pieces toward inevitable defeat. When the last echo of gunfire faded, the canyon lay strewn with abandoned torches and the groans of wounded men. The remaining riders, their carriage broken, spurred their horses and fled toward the open desert, the pounding of hooves dwindling into the vast silence. Maddox himself disappeared into the darkness with a curse, his threat unfinished but not forgotten. Jonas lowered his revolver and let out a slow breath, the night air cool against the heat of battle. Around him the townsfolk emerged from cover, eyes wide with the realization that they were still alive. The blacksmith wiped soot from his brow. The boy's hands trembled as he lowered his rifle. In their faces Jonas saw the spark he had hoped for, not the wild exultation of victory, but the steadier flame of courage found and held. He gathered them with a quiet word, leading the way back toward the sleeping town. Lanterns flickered to life as they entered, Clara rushing from the church with her child in her arms. Relief broke across her face like sunrise. She stepped toward Jonas, then stopped, sensing the distance he carried like a cloak. "You kept us safe," she said softly. Jonas shook his head. "You kept yourself safe. Remember that." The sheriff approached, eyes searching the stranger's face for answers he still couldn't name. "You knew every turn of that fight before it started," he said. "Who are you, really?" Jonas met his gaze without flinching. "A man who's seen enough towns burn," he replied, nothing more. Before Rollins could speak again, Jonas turned toward the fading stars where the desert stretched endless and silver. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of gunpowder and sage. Somewhere out there Colt Maddox was still alive, and Jonas knew this night was only a reprieve. But for now Outlaw stood unburned, and the quiet strength in the townspeople's eyes was proof that fear had not won. He let that truth settle in his heart like a small, hard ember and walked into the soft gray of approaching dawn, his shadow long and solitary across the dust. The first pale streaks of dawn bled across the desert, washing the horizon in silver and rose. Ash Hollow lay hushed, every board and brick steeped in the night's unease. Horses shifted restlessly in their corrals as if they sensed the hour's sharp edge. Jonas Hale stood at the edge of the main street, coat collar turned up against a chill that carried the scent of dust and powder. He had not slept. He had been listening, to the distant creak of saddles, to the steady beat of his own heart, to the old ghosts whispering that this day had been coming for years. From the far ridge came a single, deliberate drum of hooves. Colt Maddox rode alone, a dark figure against the awakening sky, his black hat low, his coat snapping like a banner in the wind. He reined up in the center of town, horse snorting clouds of steam. The echo of that arrival reached every corner, stirring curtains and waking those who had tried to pretend the night would fade without consequence. Doors cracked open. Shadows of faces appeared behind window panes. One by one, townsfolk stepped onto the boardwalks until the street became a narrow corridor of held breath. Maddox swung down from the saddle, boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. His grin was a white scar across his weathered face. "You cost me men," he called, his voice rough as gravel but bright with a cruel amusement. "Cost me pride. And I don't let that stand." He spat into the dust and let the silence gather around his words. "So here it is, stranger. You and me. At first light. Let's see if the stories about you are true, or if you're just another old drifter with a quick tongue." Jonas stepped forward, each footfall unhurried. He stopped 10 paces away, the rising sun catching the faint silver in his hair. The crowd murmured like a restless tide. Maddox's eyes narrowed, measuring the quiet figure, hunting for weakness. "You look tired, old man," he said, mocking. "Might be your hands too slow now." Jonas's gaze was steady, a pale flame behind shadow. "The sun's climbing," he said softly. "Best we don't keep it waiting." The sheriff tried once to speak, but the weight of the moment pressed his words back into his throat. Clara stood among the townspeople, her son clasped tight to her side, eyes wide with a fear that carried something deeper, a recognition that this stranger who had protected them was about to step into the fire alone. The street emptied of sound. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. Maddox adjusted his stance, fingers brushing the worn grip of his revolver. The world shrank to 2 men and the space between them, a narrow river of dust glowing with the first full light of morning. The sun's rim cleared the ridge. Hands blurred. The report of a single shot cracked the dawn like a thunderclap. Birds startled from the eaves, wings beating a frantic rhythm against the sudden silence. Maddox staggered, eyes wide in disbelief. A neat dark hole blossomed on the brim of his hat, a hair's breadth from his skull. His own gun remained half-drawn, useless. He let it fall, the clatter shockingly loud, and dropped to his knees as though the earth itself demanded it. Jonas stood untouched, revolver lowered, smoke curling from a barrel in a thin, ghostly ribbon. For a heartbeat no one moved. Then Maddox's breath hitched, the last of his bravado unraveling. Who the hell are you?" he rasped. The name came not from Jonas's lips, but from the sheriff's, spoken in a whisper that carried to every ear. "Lightning Hale," Rollins said, eyes wide with a dawning memory. "Jonathan Hale." A ripple of astonishment passed through the crowd. Children clutched their mothers. Old-timers muttered half-forgotten tales, a gunfighter faster than any man alive, a legend who vanished after the Red Rock standoff a decade ago. They said he'd been killed, or had killed too many and wandered into the wilderness to atone. They said no one could match the speed of Lightning Hale. Jonas, Jonathan, let the name settle like dust on the morning air. He holstered his weapon with a motion as smooth as the draw had been, a quiet punctuation to the story others now told for him. Maddox lowered his head, shame and fear mixing in the tremor of his shoulders. The outlaw who had terrorized half the territory looked suddenly small, a man stripped of myth. "You should leave what's left of your gang," Jonas said, voice even but edged with finality. "Leave this land and never return." Maddox swallowed hard, nodding once. He stumbled to his feet, hat in hand, and back toward his horse under the unyielding gaze of the town. No one followed as he mounted and rode into the empty horizon, a dark speck swallowed by the endless plain. When the last echo of hooves faded, the spell broke. Townspeople exhaled as if they'd been holding the same breath all night. Clara stepped forward, her son clinging to her skirts, and looked up at the men who had saved them. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk it? After all you've seen?" Jonathan's eyes softened, the hard flint giving way to a weary gentleness. "Because I helped start the kind of world men like Maddox thrive in," he said. "Spent years feeding it. Thought I could bury that with my name." He looked down the empty street, where the sun now blazed bright and merciless. But a fire doesn't die just because a moon walks away. Sometimes you have to face it one last time. The sheriff approached, hat in hand, a still etched across his face. "We owe you everything," he said. "Stay. Be our law. This town needs a man like you." Jonathan shook his head. "It needs men like all of you. You stood your ground. That's the only law that lasts." Clara's boy stepped closer, eyes wide with a child's wonder. "Mr. Hale," he whispered, tasting the name like a secret. Jonathan crouched, meeting the boy's gaze, and laid a calloused hand gently on his shoulder. "Be better than I was," he said. "That's all the legend you'll ever need." He straightened and turned toward the road that led west, where the morning light spilled endless and gold. The crowd parted without a word, watching as he walked past the saloon, past the church whose bell now tolled faintly in the breeze. Each footfall sounded like the echo of an era ending. At the edge of town he paused, the vast desert stretching before him, alive with possibility and silence. He tipped his hat once, a quiet farewell to the people who had glimpsed the men behind the legend, then swung into the saddle. The bay horse shifted, eager for the trail. Without looking back, Jonathan Lightning Hale rode into the rising sun, a solitary figure against the boundless sky, leaving behind a town that would forever speak his name in the hushed tones reserved for myths, and for men who once carried the weight of violence only to lay it down. The morning after the duel broke clear and sharp, a sky of pale silver stretching endless over the basin. Dew clung to the dry grass like a thousand tiny mirrors, and the scent of gunpowder lingered faintly, the last breath of the night's violence. The bodies of Maddox's men had been gathered and the wounded tended, but the town remained hushed, as if a single shout might call the darkness back. Along the far ridge, the surviving outlaws fled in twos and threes, their silhouettes shrinking against the brightening horizon. No one gave chase. Fear of Jonas Hale's speed had settled deeper than any bullet could wound, and the legend of Lightning Hale was already traveling with them, whispered in rough voices and carried on the cold dawn wind. Jonas stood in the center of the street, hat in hand, the rising sun catching the silver at his temples. The sheriff approached quietly, boots scuffing the dust. Deke Rollins looked older than he had the night before, as though the long vigil had carved new lines across his face. He held out a gleaming badge, its star catching the newborn light. "This town needs a lawman," he said, voice low but firm. "Someone who can keep it safe." Jonas studied the badge a long moment. The metal glimmered like a fragment of the rising sun, yet it felt heavier than any gun. He closed Rollins's fingers gently around it. "Laws and the people who stood their ground," he said. "Not in a star pinned to a coat." Rollins's eyes searched his, perhaps hoping for an argument that never came. Finally he nodded, a quiet acceptance in the motion. "Then at least take the reward." The saloons raised a purse. "You earned it 10 times over." Jonas shook his head. "I came for an ending, not a wage." They stood in silence until a soft voice broke the stillness. Clara Finch stepped from the edge of the crowd, her boy clutching her hand. Morning light wove gold through her hair and turned the child's eyes to polished amber. She stopped before Jonas, a question and a thank you both written across her face. "You could stay," she said. It wasn't a plea, only a truth offered into the cool air. "We'd see to it you had a place." Jonas looked down at the boy, who stared up at him with an unguarded trust that a man like him had long ago stopped expecting. He crouched, meeting the child's gaze, and placed a rough, warm hand on his small shoulder. "Your mama's braver than most men I've known," he said. "Remember that when the world tries to tell you otherwise." The boy's lips parted as if to ask a question, but Jonas's quiet smile stilled it. He straightened and met Clara's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of paths that could never meet yet would always share this morning. He tipped his hat in a gesture more intimate than any embrace. "Keep him safe," he said softly. Clara nodded, her throat working against words that would not come. Jonas turned toward the hitching post where his bay waited, mane ruffled by the waking breeze. The crowd parted without a sound. He swung into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to the trail. For a heartbeat he sat there, outlined against the spreading light, a solitary figure poised between earth and sky. The narrator's voice seemed to rise from the hush itself, as if the land were speaking. "Some men are shaped by the violence they survive," it said, "and some by the peace they seek." Jonathan Lightning Hale carried both. He had drawn faster than the eye could follow, but his true aim was a world where speed and skill no longer ruled. He left behind no claim, no coin, only the memory of a dawn when courage outshone fear. Jonas touched his heels to the bay's flanks. Hooves struck the hardpan with a sound like a heartbeat, steady and certain. He rode westward into the pale morning, the rising sun burnishing the edges of his coat until he seemed almost a silhouette cut from light. Behind him Ash Hollow slowly stirred to life, doors opening, voices tentative, the first hammer of the blacksmith echoing like a promise. By the time the church bell tolled its slow, hopeful chime, the rider was a distant shape dissolving into the horizon, where sky and sand met in a shimmer of endless possibility. And those who had watched him go would tell their children and their children's children that they had seen Lightning Hale with their own eyes, a man who outran death not for glory, but for the quiet redemption found in walking away.